In this episode, I'm going to be showing you how I make sourdough bread. It's a long process of kind of learning I've been on. I'm probably on my, I don't know, probably about 7 loaves I've made so far. It's not that many, and I'm still learning loads every time. But I have kind of worked out a system that works for me, and it's getting easier. It's getting to the point where I don't really need to think about it now when I do it, which is great, because at first sourdough can be a bit confusing and overwhelming. And before I show you my processes, I thought I would just talk about it a little bit for that reason, because I know sourdough can be a bit overwhelming at first for people. The first few times I tried, I'd found a sort of schedule of how to time things on a website, and I was trying to follow that. And I was having some issues, and I talked to my friend Luke. Hi Luke, if you're watching, thank you for all your sourdough advice you've given me. And he was sort of saying that you have to kind of figure out your system for yourself, because the timings will vary so much depending on, what sort of climate people live in when they're making this bread and stuff. So you can't necessarily find a system on a website that will automatically kind of be foolproof for you. So that's something I kind of had to learn, was to figure out my own kind of schedule and what fits around my work and my kind of day, and the sort of climate that I live in, which is England. It's quite cold. I use the kind of fold and stretch method, where over the course of a day I kind of make my dough. It has very long kind of fermentation time. I make the dough early-ish, and then I do a series of stretches and folds of the dough throughout the day, shape the loaf in the evening, and then bake it the following morning. But as I say, you will probably find that different systems work for you. I'll tell you the schedule, the kind of timings that I use, in case it's helpful for you. But as I say, these might not work for everyone. So what I tend to do is I usually bake on a Friday morning. So that means I make my dough on Thursday. So that means I get my sourdough starter out of the fridge on Tuesday to start feeding it, start regular feedings to kind of make it really kind of active. And I feed it twice a day. I just do morning and evening. So I do that from Tuesday through to Thursday. By that point, it's usually pretty active and looking really good to start making the dough. So what I do on Thursday morning is I give it one more feed when I get up. I also then, about 11 o'clock, I make my autolyse, which is just a mix of the flour and water that's going to be in the dough. The sourdough at that point is separate, and that sits for an hour. That's a good way to get your flour really hydrated before you kind of start making the dough. So that's at 11 a.m. At 12, when I'm kind of making my lunch, I'll mix the sourdough starter, some salt and a tiny bit more water into that mixture. And that's my dough kind of finished. At that point, I start setting a timer every hour to kind of do a stretch and fold. You'll see this in the episode in a bit. And the great thing about that method is that each stretch and fold takes kind of seconds. It's very, very fast. So even though making the dough takes all day, you're not actually putting much time into it at all. It's just a case of you have to be there to kind of do the thing every hour, which, as a lot of us are working from home at the moment, that is kind of easier to do than it would usually be. So yeah, throughout the afternoon, I do a series of stretch and folds every hour. I've also tried every half hour, and it doesn't seem to make a huge amount of difference. Usually by about 6, I'm ready to shape my loaf. I shape it on the kitchen counter, leave it there for half an hour to kind of sit. And then I put it into a banneton. I was going to say, I don't actually have a proper banneton, which are the little baskets that people use to make sourdough. I just use a bowl lined with a towel, which works perfectly well. So I put it into that once it's been shaped and sat for half an hour. I put it in the fridge, and then the following morning, Friday morning, I get the oven on, get it really hot. I turn out the dough, score the top, chuck it in a sort of cast iron pan with a lid that I have. And that seems to work for me. And as I say, I've been finding it's getting easier and easier. I don't need to think about the process or the timings anymore. I don't need to check my notes. But there is still stuff that, each time is kind of different. The main thing I've been having trouble with lately has been scoring the top of the loaf with a blade, which you do so that the dough has room to kind of expand without sort of tearing. And for the life of me, I made a series of maybe 4 loaves where I just couldn't get the blade to go through the dough. I've started using quite a high hydration dough, which is great for sourdough. That's another whole thing you can get into, as like hydration percentages, baker's percentages. There's an app you can get that will do it for you, so that's quite handy. I was very happy when I discovered that. But yeah, using a high hydration dough, it can be a little harder to handle, and when you kind of slash it with the blade can kind of drag and get a bit kind of stuck. Sprinkling it with water is supposed to help, but it wasn't really helping me. I think that the type of blade, I've got a scalpel, like an actual surgical scalpel, I'm going to try for my next loaf at the end of this week. I'll let you know how that goes, but hopefully that will help. And the other thing I wanted to say is just that despite all the kind of issues, the very first sourdough loaf I ever made looked like an absolute dog's dinner. It was just kind of lumpy. When I turned it out of the bowl, the towel got stuck to it and I had to pull it off. It knocked all the air out of the dough. It was just like a lumpy mess, but I baked it anyway and it was still delicious bread. So I've never had a sourdough loaf that hasn't turned into delicious bread that's really, really good to eat. So as much as you might, when you're learning the process, you might end up with loaves that are too ugly to put on Instagram or something like that. That doesn't matter. You've still got a delicious loaf of bread that you can eat. I've never had one that hasn't been inedible. Even that one where I knocked all the air out, it still kind of rose in the oven. It was really, really good. So don't get kind of disheartened if you're not producing beautiful, perfect loaves like you see on social media. It's still worth doing anyway, and it's just kind of a fun process. I love the flavour of sourdough bread, so that's why I've been sticking with it and getting better, hopefully. Today I'm making sourdough bread. I make a loaf of bread in my bread machine once a week, and I do use sourdough in that pretty much every time, but I don't consider it proper sourdough. I refresh my sourdough usually the day before, and I do a half quantity of yeast and the sourdough starter, and then I make a loaf in the machine. And it does give it a lovely flavour, but it doesn't really have the texture of a classic sourdough loaf. I've only really done a classic sourdough loaf one time before. It came out reasonably well, so I'm going to try today for the second time. I'm actually going to make two. One is going to be a gift for somebody. And I'm thinking about doing the two in slightly different ways so that I can compare. I've got my starter here that I started refreshing 2 days ago. It's Thursday today. So I got that out of the fridge on Tuesday and I've been feeding it twice a day ever since. It's really active and bubbly. So here's how I feed my starter. As with all aspects of bread making, everyone has their own methods, but this is what I do. Here's my starter that I keep in the fridge. I keep it in this small jar because I just keep quite a small amount, and then I take out what I need, transfer a bit into a second jar, a larger one, and this is the one that I keep outside of the fridge for a few days when I'm building up to baking. I was wondering the other day why I keep them separate and why I don't just bring the same jar in and out of the fridge, and I guess there is something to be said for if I did something wrong to this one, or if I dropped the jar and smashed it or something, that I would still have starter that I could use that's separate. So yeah, when I begin on the first day, I take a small amount, 25 or 30 grams of the starter, put it into this jar and top up with the same, like 25 or 30 grams of flour and 25 or 30 grams of water. And then I just repeat that process, kind of not taking this out once I've done that, once that's done. But with this jar, morning and evening, I add 20 to 30 grams of flour and water each time and stir. That seems to work fine. I'll just show you this cool spoon. This is what Sergio got me for Christmas this year, because he saw me doing this with small amounts of flour, and it also has a clip so that you can use it to keep your bag closed. And this is some brand new kind of artisan rye flour. Can never find rye very easily, so I decided to order a big batch online, and that's what I've got here. I find for my sourdough loaves that a little bit of rye is enough, so I tend to just use the rye to feed the starter. Starter seems to really like rye, and then I just use plain white bread flour for the rest of the flour that goes into the loaf, so the only rye is in the starter. So that was 30 and 30 grams of water. and give it a really, really good mix. And then the rubber band is so that I can judge how much my starter has increased in volume over the next few hours. So I just place the rubber band at the level that the starter has reached, and then hopefully it'll more than double within a few hours, and then I'll feed it again this evening. So the next step is I need to do the autolyse. I think that's how you pronounce it. So I'm still not using the starter. I'm just mixing the flour and water that's going to make the bulk of the dough together, just flour and water, mixing them through, and I'm going to leave that for an hour, I think. Some people do this step, some people don't. There's a whole debate about it. I think the idea is that you really thoroughly hydrate the flour before you add the starter and everything else. But it's what I did last time, so I'm just going to do that again, and I'll show you all the different steps throughout the day. So I've just got my flour and water here, mix it together with my hands, cover it and leave it in a warm place for 1 hour. So as I mentioned, I'm making 2 loaves, partly because I want one as a gift for a friend and one for myself, but also because the last time I made a loaf, it was quite large, and I have a really nice bread knife, but the blade isn't that long, and the loaf was, almost pretty much the same length as the blade, which made it quite hard to cut slices of the loaf. And so I had the idea if I made 2 slightly smaller ones, then maybe they would be easier to slice and I would be able to have a gift. So I've slightly increased the quantities, and I'm going to do 2 slightly smaller instead of 1 large one. So here's my autolyse, my mixture of flour and water that's been resting for an hour. I bought these stretchy lids recently, loads of them. They're really good because I really wanted to cut down on the amount of cling film I was using. So now I'm going to add to this salt, a little more water, and my sourdough starter. So I'm going to mix this all together using my hands, using a kind of pinching motion to try and make sure that the salt is kind of evenly distributed through the dough. And then the dough is ready for bulk fermentation, which means that I'm going to basically have it sitting in a warm place, and I'm going to do a kind of stretch fold action with it every kind of half an hour over a few hours. So there's no kneading involved in this, it's just this kind of regular stretch and rest process that develops the gluten without you having to kind of knead for 10 minutes, which is kind of handy. I've got some work I need to do that's quite monotonous, so I'm going to do kind of half an hour of work, have a break, do a stretch of the dough, another half an hour of work, that kind of thing for the rest of the day probably. Now it's time to do a stretch and fold. It helps to have damp hands for this to stop it sticking. And what you're going to do is kind of lift the dough out of the bowl, stretch it up as much as possible and sort of fold it in on itself. And you do that 4 times, turning the bowl a quarter turn each time. So north, south, east, west, sort of 90-degree turns. And I use the handles to kind of remind me where I'm at with my turns. So here's the first stretch. The second stretch. Third. And the fourth stretch. It's an incredible process because within a couple of stretches your dough goes from a total mess into something that's beginning to have structure. Really, really interesting to do. Last time I made this, I had to do this series of 4 stretches 3 times every half hour. So I'm going to see if that's the same this time. I'll talk a little bit about how you can tell whether the dough is ready when I do my next stretch. Some ways to test whether your dough is ready. Here's my dough after one set of folds. It's got some nice bubbles, but it's very flat. You can see that it's kind of flowing to the edges of the bottom of the bowl and not really sitting in a sort of ball shape or anything. Third stretch of this dough, you can see it's got a slightly more of a domed appearance and it's holding its shape a little bit more. So I think the best way to check that my dough is kind of fully proved and has developed gluten and is ready to bake is the window pane test, which involves just kind of pulling a portion of the dough up out of the bowl and then seeing how thin you can stretch it out. As you can see here, this is really, really thin and see-through. I can see my fingers through it and it's not tearing. For a little while I have been worried that this dough is too wet. It is wetter than last time I tried this. And so this is a point where I need to shape little loaves and leave them to just sit on the counter for 25 minutes. I kind of managed to form a little blob there, so I'm just going to do that with the second one. The way you do this is you kind of do this little pulling towards you on the counter method, which kind of drags the close side underneath and creates a sort of surface tension stretch on the top. So what happens is these now sit uncovered for 25 minutes, then they go upside down into a little banneton for a final prove. What I thought I might do is prove one overnight and bake one straight away just to see the difference. Last time I proved overnight, but I kind of felt last time that my dough was maybe ready to go in the oven, so I wondered what the difference would be, and I thought since I'm doing two this time I could do both ways and then compare. Okay, so this is the final stage for these. We're again going to stretch them out and do more surface tension, and then I've prepared two little bowls lined with towels and also my semolina flour, which is amazing for helping dough not stick. So here are my two flours that arrived in the post this week. I was so happy that they got to me in time for me to use. The semolina arrived just a couple of hours before I needed to dust my tea towel for the sourdough loaf, so that was amazing timing, and it worked really, really well. I didn't have any issues with the dough sticking to the towel, so that's been a success so far. The other thing I ordered is this gram flour, which is for an Indian recipe that my friend Rupert made with me. She taught me how to make it, and I'm going to make it. I've made it once since then by myself, and I'm going to make it again tomorrow and show you how to do it. So yeah, I needed this flour for that. It's a lovely bag. I really like the colours of this bag. So yeah, I'm experimenting with a few new processes and ingredients this week. So what I'm doing now is flipping these over and then pulling outside edges in to sort of make a little parcel and pinching together in the middle. And again, you're sort of creating more surface tension on this side. And then I'm going to do these pulls again. These just need to rest for a couple of minutes before I'm going to flip them upside down and put them in these baskets here. And then one of these is going to go into the fridge covered in plastic overnight to be baked in the morning. The other one I'm going to rest under plastic for about 20 minutes, and then it's going to go into, I don't have a Dutch oven exactly, I have a sort of metal pan that has a lid that can go inside the oven, and that's what I used last time to bake in. So one of them that's preheating in the oven right now, getting the oven really hot. I mean, I'm going to try one of these right away just to see what happens. Here is where we get the proved loaf out, put it onto some greaseproof paper. I kind of make a circle, but with these little bits that I can use as handles on either side so that I can then lower it into the bottom of my pot. So let's just get the heated pot out of the oven. going to slash the top in a square pattern. I don't have a thing to mist with, but I sometimes just do a tiny little flick of water like that to create a little extra moisture inside. And then this is going back in the oven. So that's gone in for 20 minutes inside the pot. After 20 minutes, I'll take the pot out, take the loaf out of the pot and just put it on the oven shelf for another 30 minutes. Although as this is a small loaf, I might have to cut those times short a little bit. So here are my two loaves. The one on the left I baked the same day that I made the dough. The one on the right I baked this morning after a long overnight proof in the fridge. I think it's fair to say the one on the right looks better, definitely has more of that classic sourdough kind of look, colour and texture to it. Lovely kind of blisters on there. The one on the left definitely looks kind of underproofed. It's kind of smaller and probably denser. I won't really know until I cut into it what these are like. The one on the right is definitely the one I will choose to give to my friend as a gift. But yeah, really interesting. I'm quite happy, especially with the one that had the long proof. It's been a couple of weeks since my last sourdough loaf, and I've got another one today ready to go in the oven. I'm going to do one score across the top today instead of the square. I think I need to cut a little deeper when I score the top, so that's something else I'm going to try. I'd like to try and get one of those nice kind of ears that come up on the top of the loaf. So I'm going to get the oven preheating and get this ready to go in. So yeah, I made a terrible mistake. As you can see, my loaf is a little burnt. Completely forgot that the second phase of the baking, you're supposed to turn the oven temperature down, and I forgot to do that, so it just baked on too high of a temperature. But I mean, the shape is really great. I'm really happy with the rise. It's so round. And I think it's probably fine inside. I'm going to cut it open and see what it's like on the inside. I might just have to cut some of the crust off before eating. But yeah, now I'm just really keen to make it again and try and get everything right finally. It looks quite nice on the inside. Got a really nice texture. I actually don't like sourdough to have massive holes because I always do melted butter on mine, and that can be annoying when it's all holes and the butter's just running through. So I'm really happy with how that looks on the inside. My friend Luke, who's an avid sourdough baker, was telling me that it's quite trendy to kind of have a very dark crust on sourdough at the moment, and he said he thought this looked fine. I think he was kind of being kind, but yeah, I'm fully expecting it to kind of be perfectly nice. It's just a little bit too burnt on the very outside edges. Look at this baking injury from a week ago. I burnt myself making last week's loaf, and a week later it's still kind of painful. So I'm really excited to be able to show you this loaf, which was the loaf I baked this morning. And I think it's got to be the loaf that I'm most happy with that I've made so far. I wanted to talk about the issues that I was having with scoring the top of the loaf. I became a bit obsessed with it. I know I mentioned at the very start of this episode that I was having trouble getting the blade to go through the dough sort of cleanly and deep enough. I kept aiming to have that ear across the centre of the loaf that is kind of a classic sourdough thing where the ear lifts up and browns along the top. And I just couldn't get it to happen. It happened one time and I was really happy. It wasn't a massive ear, but it looked really nice. And after that one time, I just couldn't get it to happen. What kept happening was that when I slashed the loaf, it would kind of spread quite quickly. And also when I baked it, it would then just bake over into a completely smooth crust. You could kind of see where the score had been, but it would just open up during baking and smooth off and become part of a round crust on the top. And I consulted with my friend Luke about this quite a lot. We were discussing all the different possibilities, whether it was the hydration level of the dough, whether my dough was overproofed maybe I was leaving it too long before shaping it. But Luke also pointed out that my loaves weren't ever bursting at all. Sometimes what happens to people's loaves when they don't score well is that the loaf then kind of bursts somewhere else on the loaf, like at the side during baking. And that's down to when you first put the bread in the oven at a very high temperature, it has a really fast initial kind of expansion. And that's what the score is for, to let it expand without sort of tearing and bursting open. But my loaves weren't kind of doing that at all, even though the scoring wasn't really working. They also weren't bursting open, and that led us to kind of conclude after a while that probably the issue was my oven temperature. In this house we've got a very old oven. It's kind of old and rubbish and the seal isn't good, and for a while I've had a little external thermometer that you can kind of hang on the shelf of the oven, and if that's to be believed, I started paying more attention to the readings on that. And if that's correct, then my oven really doesn't get much higher than 220, even if I kind of preheat it for an hour with the dial turned up as high as it goes. So I think that was my issue with getting an ear on the loaf. And then Luke had a really good suggestion, which was to stop worrying about the ear and instead just maybe try some scoring patterns that weren't so much to do with getting a big lifted section. And you see these kind of on Instagram and online where people do these crazy designs with hundreds of cuts and then different coloured doughs and all kinds of things, and I always thought they were a bit much. Like, I'm not super interested in doing those really crazy designs. But Luke sent a few suggestions and we both liked this kind of diamond pattern and some of the other ones that were on there, so that's what I decided to try. And that gives me a way to kind of have a fun design on the loaf without worrying about the ear issue, and it seems to have worked really well on this one. I did sprinkle on a little bit of extra flour before baking to get the difference in colour between the opened up parts that have no flour on, where the slash has expanded, and it's just worked really well. I think it looks really nice. I also tried a few different techniques. There's one called slap and fold, where you kind of knead your dough by slapping it. It works with high hydration doughs. You slap it and pull it and stretch it and fold it over itself on the counter repeatedly. That happens before bulk fermentation. So when you first mix your dough, you then knead it for a while using this slapping motion, and then you do a few more stretches and folds, but it's pretty much ready to go. So that reduces the time of fermentation. I think Luke said the same as me, which was we both kind of found that a bit pointless, in the sense that it's a whole extra step. It takes a good sort of 15 minutes of your time. It makes a mess of your kitchen counter because the wet dough kind of gets everywhere, and it just doesn't do anything for the dough that you don't get through doing the slow stretch and folds anyway. It's just a lot more work and a lot more mess. So I've kind of discounted that method for now, and I've gone back to my kind of slow stretch and folds. And I've also been trying to pay attention to my shaping to get a really good surface tension, so that I'm hoping that will help my dough maybe not spread quite so much when I'm slashing it before it goes in the oven. I noticed that some bakers were kind of pressing the dough really quite flat into this little square before kind of shaping it by stretching the edges and pulling it over. So with this loaf I tried that, And then I also gave it a final, you can do a final little stretch while it's upside down in the banneton where you just pull the edges over again. I did that with this one. Again, as I mentioned before, these are all really small changes that don't seem to have a massive effect on my loaves. My loaves all turn out pretty much the same shape. So I guess that's good that I've got a system that works, but it is fun to try different things. And I'm looking forward to trying some more kind of designs on the tops of my loaves. I hope this has been an interesting episode and not confusing, because I filmed little bits over the course of quite a few months. But I guess that's interesting because it shows you my kind of journey as I tried different things and as I tried to understand the process better and what might be, going right and what might be going wrong. So send me your loaves if you're doing kind of similar things. If anyone out there is doing sourdough, I'd love to see what you're working on.